Harthacanute was King of England from March 1040 to June 1042, a little over 2 years, roughly from when he was 23 to 25 years old. 5 years before he became King of England, he ascended to the throne of Denmark in 1035. So for those 2 final years, he reigned both kingdoms simultaneously. Harthacanute was the son of Canute, who was the King of England for about 19 years from 1016 to 1035. Prior to him ascending to the throne, his older half-brother Harold Harefoot had been king. We covered Harold in our previous video, which you can check out below. Let's take a look at where he fits in our timeline. Here he is, coming to the throne just 26 years before the Battle of Hastings, and over 600 years before King Charles I was beheaded. Harthacanute was born in or around the year 1017. His mother was Emma, a Normandy noblewoman who had previously been married to AEthelred the Unready, who had been King of England from 978 to 1016. After Aethelred died, she'd married Canute, who reigned from 1016 to 1035. It's worth pausing here for a moment to note that Emma was an interesting character in her own right. Not only was she married to 2 kings of England, Aethelred and Canute, in addition, 2 of her children would also become kings of England. Harthacanute, her son with Canute and the subject of this video, and Edward the Confessor, her son with Aethelred, who we'll cover in our next video. If that wasn't enough to cement her place in English history, her brother back in Normandy, Richard II, was the grandfather of William the Conqueror. In fact, William's claim to the English throne is largely based on the fact that he was a blood relative of Emma's, a 2 times Queen of England. But for the purposes of this video, let's return to Harthacanute. Prior to marrying Emma, Canute had been married to a woman called Ælfgifu of Northampton. When he became king, Canute set her aside and married Emma. It's claimed that at the time he declared that Harthacanute, his child from his second marriage to Emma, would succeed him on the thrones of Denmark and England. But, as we saw in the last video, things didn't go according to plan, and Harold Harefoot, his son by Ælfgifu, ended up on the throne. Towards the end of his life, King Canute found that trying to rule his 2 kingdoms, England and Denmark, was troublesome, mainly because in the 1020s Denmark was being threatened by Norway and Sweden. Canute countered this by bolstering his defences there and sending his 8-year-old son Harthacanute to Denmark to prepare him for rule in the future. Canute stamped his authority all over the region, and in 1030 placed his eldest son from his first marriage, Svein Knutsen, on the Norwegian throne, ably assisted by his mother, Ælfgifu, also mother of Harold Harefoot, who we covered in our previous video. This mother and son pairing proved unpopular though, in essence because they imposed heavy taxes and favoured Danish advisors over Norwegian ones. Pretty soon they found themselves on the run from angry Norwegians and had to seek shelter in Harthacanute's Danish court. Things got so bad, the Norwegians even started threatening the Danish court itself. It's at this point that the 2 half-brothers, Harthacanute and Svein, turned to their father Canute for help. Unluckily for them, the news came through that Canute had died in November 1035. Harthacanute was naturally crowned King of Denmark, as had long been planned, but he was immediately placed in a quandary. On the one hand, he needed to go back to England so he could be crowned king there as well. On the other, he couldn't leave Denmark at such a dangerous time, with the Norwegians threatening invasion. In the meantime, Harthacanute's half-brother, Harold Harefoot, had staked a claim to the throne of England. As we learned in our previous video, Harold Harefoot was eventually accepted as king, though many noblemen in England refused to back him. As time wound on, however, the nobility in England gradually came to accept Harold as their king, including Godwin of Wessex, one of the most powerful men in England and the father of another Harold, Harold Godwinson, who would later be king, only to be defeated by William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Back in Denmark, Harthacanute and Svein started making plans to recover Norway. In the late 1030s, though, Svein died, and Harthacanute set aside invasion plans, and instead settled for a treaty with King Magnus I of Norway. More of that treaty later. In England, meanwhile, Harthacanute's mother, Emma, began plotting. She felt outraged that her upstart stepson had rushed onto the English throne ahead of her son Harthacanute. It seems that she decided on a course of action, writing a letter to her sons from her marriage to King Ethelred, Edward and Alfred, who were in exile in Bruges at this time. Edward, later crowned English king and known as Edward the Confessor, sacked Southampton and sailed back to Bruges. Alfred, however, was captured with the help of Godwin of Wessex, taken to King Harold Harefoot, blinded, and died soon afterwards. Emma was outraged and fled to Bruges. There she commissioned a book called the Encomium Emmae Reginae, which was filled with prose singing her praises and attacking the king Harold Harefoot. An invasion of England was now on the cards. According to the Encomium, Harthacanute was outraged at his half-brother's murder, and having signed a treaty with Norway, was effectively free to invade. Before any invasion could happen, though, Harold Harefoot became gravely ill and died. Harthacanute was invited to come to England and be crowned king. Not taking any chances, he turned up with a large invasion force, just in case there was any opposition from English nobles who had supported Harold Harefoot. Still furious that Harold had murdered Alfred, Harthacanute ordered the recently deceased King Harold's body to be dug up and beheaded. Other conspirators were put on trial. One of those conspirators was Godwin of Wessex, who only escaped death by convincing the king that he was acting under Harold's orders and paying Harthacanute a huge sum of money. Harthacanute's short reign proved unpopular. He ruled autocratically because he didn't trust his English earls, and he levied a harsh tax regime on the English. So much so that the people of Worcester rioted and killed 2 of his tax collectors. Harthacanute's response? Burn Worcester to the ground. At this stage, Harthacanute wasn't a well man and probably knew he didn't have long to live. One day, he decided to attend a friend's wedding in Lambeth in London. It must have been nice having the King of England attend your wedding. Only, the story goes that as Harthacanute raised his drink to toast the bride, he keeled over stone dead, possibly having suffered a stroke. At that point, he had not produced any children, and had promised the throne to his half-brother Edward, his mother Emma's surviving son from her marriage to King Ethelred. Before we move on, though, remember that treaty Harthacanute had signed with King Magnus I, which meant that he didn't have to go to war with Norway. After he died, this was to have significant repercussions for English history. According to the treaty, Harthacanute and Magnus agreed that between them, whoever survived would inherit the other's kingdom. If Magnus died first, Harthacanute, King of Denmark, would become King of Norway too. If Harthacanute died first, Magnus, King of Norway, would also become King of Denmark. Well, Harthacanute went first. The treaty was invoked and Magnus became King of Denmark. Only Magnus didn't stop there. Given that Harthacanute was now, at the time of his death in 1042, the King of England, Magnus decided that according to the treaty, he had a right to become not just King of Denmark, but King of England too. When it became clear that Magnus would have to go to war to press his claim, he backed down. That sounds like the end of the matter, but actually, this treaty of the late 1030s would be used 30 years later by Magnus's successor, Harold Hardrada, as a justification for his invasion of England in 1066. Indeed, without that invasion, which resulted in Harold Hardrada being killed and his army defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the English king Harold Godwinson, it's possible the subsequent Battle of Hastings, 3 weeks later, might have gone a different way. As we know from the history books, after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, King Harold and his army marched 200 miles south to fight William of Normandy at Hastings. Without Harthacanute and Magnus's treaty, it's possible Harold Hardrada wouldn't have had the excuse he needed to invade England in September 1066, in which case King Harold's army may well have been less exhausted and more able to fight off the Normans, changing the course of history entirely. As we discussed in our previous video on Ethelred the Unready, the Norman invasion had a huge and lasting effect on English and indeed world history. Without it and William the Conqueror, the history of England and potentially the world would have been completely different. In our next video, we'll cover the life of Harthacanute's successor, Edward the Confessor. Please remember to hit the subscribe button below to receive an alert when we upload our next video. You can also support us via Patreon using the link below.